In a small suburban town, nestled between rolling hills and calm streets, there was a school that everyone thought was the epitome of progress and inclusivity. Oakwood High School, a place where diversity was celebrated, where students from all walks of life came together to learn, play, and grow. But like many places, beneath the surface, there were issues that some didn't want to acknowledge, issues that would soon come to light in a way no one could have predicted. It was early fall when the incident happened. The crisp air of September had already set in, and students were getting into their routines. Among them was Jason Thompson, a 16-year-old black student who had transferred to Oakwood High just that year. Jason had lived most of his life in the city, but his family had moved to this quiet town to escape the chaos of urban life, hoping for a better environment for Jason to focus on his studies and make new friends. Jason was intelligent, well-spoken, and enthusiastic about his education. He had a natural curiosity that made him excel in his classes, and he quickly found himself gaining the respect of his peers. However, like many students who transfer to new schools, Jason had a period of adjustment, and Oakwood was no different. One of his classes was English, taught by Mrs. Evelyn Parker, a seasoned educator in her early 50s. Mrs. Parker had been teaching for over 25 years and was known for being strict but fair. She had a reputation for demanding high standards from her students, and her classes were often filled with students who were eager to please and eager to learn. However, behind her stern demeanor was a sense of superiority, one that had been carefully cultivated over the years. It started with small, seemingly insignificant comments. Mrs. Parker would sometimes make remarks about Jason's speech patterns or the way he expressed himself. She'd comment on his lack of formality or his unrefined manner of speaking, even though Jason had never once shown any lack of respect for her or the class. To him, these comments were odd, but he shrugged them off, thinking it might just be her teaching style. But things began to escalate when they started reading a classic novel in class, The Great Gatsby. It was a book that Mrs. Parker loved to teach, and she often used it as a way to discuss themes of class, race, and ambition. The students were tasked with writing a paper that analyzed the characters and themes within the novel. Jason, with his knack for insightful analysis, wrote a deeply thoughtful paper on the differences between the American dream as presented in the book and the way it functioned in the real world, particularly for marginalized communities. When Mrs. Parker handed back the papers, Jason was eager to see her feedback. He had worked hard on it, stayed up late making sure his arguments were solid. As he flipped through the pages of his paper, his excitement quickly turned to confusion. There, at the top of the page, written in red ink, was a single line that read, "Perhaps you should stick to the subjects you're more familiar with." Jason's heart sank. The comment felt wrong. It felt out of place, unprofessional. He stared at the words, not quite able to make sense of them. What does she mean by that? He thought to himself. He had poured his heart into that paper, and yet it seemed as though his work had been dismissed with a vague, condescending comment. As the days passed, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had been working so hard to prove himself in a new environment, to show that he was just as capable as any other student. But now, he felt like an outsider all over again. It wasn't until the next class, when Mrs. Parker began to discuss the papers with the class, that Jason realized the full extent of what was happening. As she went over the papers, Mrs. Parker made a point to praise several students, highlighting their writing skills and their analytical abilities. But when she came to Jason's paper, she simply said, Jason's paper was, well, let's just say it didn't quite live up to expectations. The class was silent. Jason's face flushed. It was clear to everyone that Mrs. Parker was treating him differently, and the awkwardness in the room only made it worse. Jason, who had never been one to shy away from speaking up, decided to confront Mrs. Parker after class. As the other students filed out, he approached her desk. "Mrs. Parker," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I don't understand why you didn't take my paper seriously. I worked hard on it." Mrs. Parker glanced up at him, her expression momentarily softening. "Jason," she began, her tone patronizing, "I know you tried your best, but sometimes people from your background just don't grasp the nuances of a book like The Great Gatsby. It's okay, really. You'll learn with time." Jason's stomach churned. He felt the weight of her words, the implicit assumption that because of his race and background, he wasn't capable of fully understanding the literature. He stood there for a moment, stunned, before walking out of the classroom, his mind racing. He had never felt so small, so inferior in his entire life. But he wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. The next few days were filled with a storm of emotions for Jason. He talked to his friends about what had happened, and they were just as shocked as he was. They had seen the subtle ways in which Mrs. Parker had singled him out, but they hadn't fully understood what was going on until he explained it. It wasn't just about the paper. It was about the way she treated him as though he didn't belong in her class, as though his intelligence was somehow inferior. Eventually, Jason decided to go to his parents. He knew this wouldn't be an easy conversation, but he had to tell them what had been happening. His mother, a strong woman who had raised him on her own, was furious when she heard about the comments and treatment he had endured. She was determined to do something about it. She wasn't going to let anyone, especially a teacher, make her son feel like he wasn't good enough. Jason's mother, Angela, reached out to the school's administration. She sent a letter detailing her concerns about Mrs. Parker's behavior, including the discriminatory remarks and the treatment of Jason's work. She requested a meeting with the principal, Ms. Brenda Cooper, to discuss the matter further. The response from the school came quicker than Angela had expected. Ms. Cooper called her the very next day to schedule a meeting. When they met in person, Ms. Cooper was polite but firm. "I understand your concerns," she said, "but Mrs. Parker has been a respected teacher at this school for many years. We take these matters seriously, but we need to hear both sides of the story before making any conclusions." Angela wasn't about to back down. "I don't care how long she's been teaching," she said, her voice steady but passionate. "If she's treating my son this way, then there's a problem. This is not the kind of behavior we tolerate in our community." The meeting ended with a promise from Ms. Cooper to investigate the issue further. But what happened next was something that no one could have predicted. 2 days later, Mrs. Parker was called into a meeting with the school administration. The investigation was thorough. Ms. Cooper spoke with other students in the class, as well as faculty members who had worked closely with Mrs. Parker. While some students were hesitant to speak out, others were more candid. They confirmed that Mrs. Parker had exhibited discriminatory behavior toward Jason, and that her comments about his background and abilities were inappropriate. But when Mrs. Parker was confronted, her response was nothing short of shocking. She claimed that she had never intended to be discriminatory, and that any comments made were simply misunderstandings. She suggested that Jason was overly sensitive, and that his reaction was due to his inability to handle constructive criticism. However, the school administration wasn't swayed by her defense. After a thorough review, it was decided that Mrs. Parker would be placed on probation and required to attend diversity and sensitivity training. She was also instructed to apologize to Jason in person and to ensure that all of her future interactions with students were conducted with respect and fairness. The school's decision was a significant one, and it sent shockwaves through the Oakwood community. For many, it was a wake-up call about the subtle ways in which racism and discrimination could manifest, even in seemingly progressive environments. But it was also a testament to the power of standing up for what's right. Jason, with the support of his family and friends, had done just that. He had stood up for himself, and in doing so, he had exposed a deep-seated issue that needed to be addressed. As for Mrs. Parker, her apology to Jason was genuine. Though it came across as awkward and uncomfortable, she apologized for her comments and assured him that she would work to change her approach in the future. Jason accepted her apology, but he made it clear that it would take time for him to trust her again. In the end, Oakwood High School became a better place because of this incident. It was a school that learned from its mistakes, a school that understood that inclusivity wasn't just about having a diverse student body. It was about creating an environment where every student felt valued, respected, and capable of achieving their full potential. And as for Jason, he continued to excel in his studies, proving that, despite the obstacles he faced, he was more than capable of achieving greatness.